Hi there, everybody. Today we are going to go over the urinary system a little bit, which is chapter 26. It is posted in your Moodle page. I got nervous at first when I opened it up. It says the reproductive system on the title page, but then when you click into the next couple of slides, it goes into the urinary system. So I don't know what happened to the title page. Somehow that got messed up. But we are doing chapter 26, which is the urinary system, not the reproductive system. So I want to go through some of the slides today. And then as we start going through, I think what I'm going to do is switch to a whiteboard and try to draw a nephron so that we can go through some of the structures of the nephron, because I think that's one of the more confusing parts and one of the more intricate parts of the urinary system. So let me share my screen. There we go. So as I said, the title slide does say chapter 26, and then it says the reproductive system, which is strange to me, and that scared me at first. It freaked me out a little bit. But then as you go in, the outcomes are clearly of the urinary system, and the slides are clearly of the urinary system. So it's just that first slide that's mislabeled. So I apologize for any confusion that causes, but rest assured that all the slides are the correct slides. So the urinary system, what does it do? Well, most people say, okay, it produces urine. Yep, it does. And where does it get that from? It's actually filtering your blood. Every time your heart beats, a portion of the blood from your heartbeat goes to your kidneys. About 1/4 of your heart blood from your heart goes to your kidneys. And the kidneys are filtering out any metabolic waste. They're filtering out anything that shouldn't be there. And they are sending it to your bladder so that you can get rid of it in your urine. Okay, so organs of the urinary system, pretty easy. There are your kidneys, right? And your kidneys have a lot of blood vessels going to them. They have two big arteries, one going to each kidney that branches into a bunch of different blood vessels. And they are producing urine, right? They're filtering the blood, and whatever gets filtered out becomes the urine. So one fluid, one liquid goes to your kidneys. Your kidney separates that into two fluids. It separates it into the waste and the clean blood. The waste is where the urine goes, right? That's what becomes your urine. And so it travels down a tube called the ureter. Okay, and you have one from each kidney. So you have a ureter coming from the left kidney and a ureter coming from the right kidney. And they meet up at the urinary bladder, which is, you just have one bladder. It's a muscular sac. And then there's a tube that leads from the bladder to the outside of the body called the urethra. And that's it, right? The kidneys are going to filter that blood. Whatever gets filtered out travels through ureters to the bladder, out the body through the urethra. You urinate it out of the body. Okay, so here is a drawing of the urinary system. These are your kidneys, they're paired, right? And there are big blood vessels going to each kidney and coming from each kidney. These yellow tubes are the ureters, right? So from each kidney is going to filter your blood. Whatever gets filtered out travels down this tube called the ureter to the bladder, right? This hollow organ here is the bladder. And then the little tube coming from the bladder to the outside of the body is called the urethra. Now notice that there are big arteries coming off. This is your aorta, right? There are two big arteries coming off the aorta going to the kidney. And there are two big veins coming off of the kidneys, right? One off of each kidney back to the vena cava to go back to the heart. What your kidneys are doing is filtering your blood. So when they filter that blood, the clean blood, right? The waste product gets filtered out and goes to your urine. The clean blood goes back through these blue veins. They're called renal veins, and they go back up the inferior vena cava back to your heart. Okay, so that's really the urinary system. It's got three functions, if you want to think of it that way: excretion, which removes metabolic waste from the body; elimination, again, you're getting it out of the body; And in doing so, you are regulating homeostasis. So we'll go into this a little bit more in the next chapter as well. But you are regulating solute concentrations in the blood. You're regulating how much water is in the blood. So you're regulating blood volume and the salt concentration in the blood. So how do your kidneys do this? Well, in each kidney, all right, we should go through your kidneys first. So the position and the associated structures of the kidneys, again, here are the kidneys. You have a right renal artery and renal vein and a left renal artery and renal vein. Those are going to your kidneys. So this is a picture from the back, right? The ureters lead down to the bladder. You can see where your kidneys are in relation to your vertebrae. They're kind of at your lower back. Okay, the kidneys are protected and stabilized by 3 layers. They have a capsule over them. It's just a fibrous capsule. Then they have perinephric fat. Peri means around, and nephron is the same as, it means kidneys. Anytime you see NEPH, it means kidneys. So there is a thick layer of adipose tissue around the kidneys as well, a thick layer of fat. And then there's what's called the renal fascia, which is a dense fibrous outer layer. So you have the kidney surrounded by capsule, and out of that is then fat, and then you have another layer of, fibrous connective tissue, and that just kind of connects the kidneys to other structures around them, so they're kind of anchored in place. Here you can see a dissection, a transverse section through somebody's abdomen, right? Here's the vertebrae, so here's the back, here's your back, here's your spleen, your pancreas, and your stomach. And you can see your kidney is behind all of that, right? It's kind of right at the back wall of your abdominal cavity. So here's your kidney right here, right? And you can see the three layers of tissue that protect it. Here's your fibrous capsule. Then you've got this perinephric fat and the renal fascia surrounding it. And that renal fascia kind of anchors the kidney to the back wall, right? It keeps it in place. Right? There is a section of the kidney or an area of the kidney called the hilum. The hilum is the point of entry and exit for the renal artery and the renal vein. It's kind of this curved in area. So if you think of the kidney like a bean, it looks like a black bean. It's that curved in area where the artery comes in and the vein leaves and the ureter leaves. So the hilum is just this region right here. And you'll see that other organs have what's called a hilum. We described the lungs as having a hilum. There are other organs that have a hilum, and that's usually where things come and go. Lymph nodes have a hilum, where things come and go, like arteries and veins. Within the kidney itself, and I'm going to go to this picture to kind of show it, how does the filtering actually work? Well, it turns out that the blood that comes in, it travels to the outer part of the kidney, comes down through these triangular structures, and in doing so, that's when the filtering happens, and it ends up kind of in this middle part of the kidney, which then it can travel down to the ureter. Now, the outer thickness of the kidney is called the cortex. The inner part is called the medulla. So everything outside of these purple triangles is the cortex. From the top of these purple triangles in is called the medulla, right? A lot of organs are divided into a cortex and a medulla. What happens is the blood comes in, right? And the blood is shuttled up to the cortex. And then it comes down through each of these pyramids. And as it's coming down through these pyramids, it's getting filtered. Right? You're filtering waste products out of the blood. You're filtering a certain amount of water out, a certain amount of salt out, all that stuff. Whatever gets filtered out gets collected in these kind of gray areas here at the bottom of each pyramid. So these purple triangles are called renal pyramids, right? At the bottom of each of the purple triangles, that's called the renal papilla. They've labeled this one here. Papilla is that little bump at the bottom of each of these triangles. And that leads into these structures, these kind of gray-white structures, right? And those are called calyces. So these are minor calyces. Individually, it's a calyx. So at the bottom of each pyramid, right, the little bump there is the renal papilla, and that leads into the minor calyx. The minor calyces lead into a major calyx. So for example, here's one minor calyx. There's another minor calyx. They both lead together into a major calyx. They just join together, right? The major calyces, so there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. The major calyces lead into what's called the renal pelvis. Okay, this area here is called the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis leads to the ureter. Why do you need to know all that? That's the path that the waste products travel. So we're going to talk more in more detail about what's going on in these pyramids. Okay, the pyramids are part of the medulla, and that's where the filtering takes place. What happens in these pyramids is that fluid, your blood, gets separated, right? It gets separated into waste products and clean blood. The waste product travels through this pathway. It goes through the renal papilla, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, to go down to the bladder. Okay, that's the pathway that the waste products take. So you need to know that. Okay, you need to know that that's where it goes. The only other thing I didn't mention here are what are called renal columns. They're just the tissue between the renal pyramids. Right, so the renal pyramids are purple here. The renal columns are the tissue between them. Okay, and here is an actual kidney that you can see. And so you can see where some of these, you can see the cortex, you can see the medulla, you can see the pyramids, right? These triangle shapes. You can actually see the renal pelvis here. You can see a major calyx. You can see the minor calyces going up to each pyramid. So the kidneys receive about a fourth of your total cardiac output. So every time your heart beats, about a fourth of that blood goes to your kidneys. And the blood gets there through a renal artery. Right? And so this is the blood flow, right? This is going to coincide with what I just talked about, the flow of the waste products. So bear with me for a couple minutes on this. So blood is coming into the kidney through arteries, right? So we're talking about the red blood vessels. So this is your renal artery, right? This big one. It's a big branch off your aorta. Your renal artery then branches into smaller arteries called segmental arteries, right? Which branch into even smaller arteries called interlobar arteries. Interlobar because they go in between each of the lobes. Right? And then the interlobar arteries branch further into cortical radiate arteries. I'm sorry. They branch into arcuate arteries, which then branch into cortical radiate arteries. I don't know why that's labeled way down there. So again, we go renal, segmental, interlobar, arcuate. The arcuate artery and the arcuate vein are what separate the cortex and the medulla, right? And then these little ones that go up into the cortex, those are called cortical radiate arteries. They radiate into the cortex. So that's where they get their name from. That's the blood coming in. The clean blood then has to go out. The clean blood. So again, coming in, you have renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, cortical radiate artery. Then filtration is going to happen. So up until that point, it's unfiltered, it's just one blood. Then filtration happens and it separates it into blood and waste. The clean blood is going to travel backwards through all those same veins. Okay, the same names as the arteries, except they're veins. It's going to go back through cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, Okay, I don't think you really have segmental veins, but these could be called segmental veins, then back to the renal vein, back to your heart. The waste product is going to travel through the renal pyramids, renal papilla, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, down through the ureter. So again, here's a little bit more of a close-up look. Right? This is right here in red. This is your interlobar artery, right? Which then branches into the arcuate arteries. These arcuate arteries separate the cortex and the medulla. And then you have these arteries that go up into the cortex. Those are called cortical radiate arteries. And what you can see is on each of the cortical radiate arteries, there are a bunch of little circles, right? And those are labeled as the glomerulus, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's where the filtration starts, okay? And the filtration happens through this purple structure here called the nephron. There's one drawn here, and there's another one drawn here. We'll talk about the differences. The nephrons actually do the filtering. There are these tubes, these long tubular structures that do the filtering. Once the blood has been filtered, once it's quote unquote clean, it travels back through these blue veins, okay? So cortical radiate veins, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, right? Back to the segmental vein, back out through the renal vein. Make sure that you know that blood flow, okay? So between the cortical radiate artery and the cortical radiate vein, right, the blood's going to travel through this nephron and get filtered. Right? And we're going to come back to that in a minute. Right? So again, blood comes in, renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar, arcuate, cortical radiate, afferent. The afferent arteriole is what leads into the nephron. So this is what we're going to talk about next. This is where the filtering actually happens. Then the blood goes back out through cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins. You don't really have segmental, like the renal veins. I'm going to actually go back to this. And I'm going to go to the whiteboard at this point. And I'm going to draw, not because I think I'm a good drawer, but because I think this may clear things up a little bit. So here we are with the whiteboard. So we're going to go this, down here. Right, and then we're going to go this. Sorry, bear with me for 1 second. All right. So this is my nephron. Okay. My nephron has a bunch of different terminology. This bulb part here is called Bowman's capsule. Okay, this part leaving Bowman's capsule, we'll go over this, and again, we'll go over this a few times. It's called the proximal convoluted tubule. The loop is called the nephron loop. It's actually sometimes called a loop of Henle. And this end is called the distal convoluted tubule. All right, so now draw a little bit more here. All right. So now what's going to happen is you've got blood vessels. You have the interlobar artery, which leads to the arcuate artery, which leads to the cortical radiate artery, which branches off and it travels into Bowman's capsule. Right, that is called your afferent arteriole. Remember, arterioles are just little arteries. So you have a little artery branching off of down here, which would be your cortical radiate down there. Right, so you have a cortical radiate artery branches into an afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole leads into Bowman's capsule. So this whole thing that I drew in black is called a nephron. We have millions of nephrons in each kidney, and the nephrons are actually what do the filtering. Now, the nephrons, we have so many nephrons in each kidney that you only need one kidney to survive, right? You could be a living donor of a kidney and you can survive on one kidney just fine. Now, what happens when the afferent arteriole brings blood into Bowman's capsule is the afferent arteriole branches into a bunch of branches. Yeah. And these branches are all capillaries. And so that is called the glomerulus. Okay, so glomerulus refers to the capillaries that are inside Bowman's capsule. So we have from the cortical radiate artery, we have a little arteriole coming off, bringing blood into Bowman's capsule, and it branches into these really small capillaries. And that network of small capillaries, that's called the glomerulus. Now, you should know that from the cardiovascular system, capillaries are really thin walls. And so what happens is things can get out, blood can get out of the blood vessels, can get out of the capillaries. So what happens while things are in the glomerulus is that liquid gets out. I'm going to draw this in green just because I don't know what else to do for color. So the blood is in the glomerulus and basically a bunch of it leaks out. And so you have in this glomerulus, I'm drawing it just kind of like little waves, right? You have liquid in that glomerulus. That liquid is going to travel through the nephron, right? Back up, other side of the nephron. And eventually go to the ureter, right? All right, so I'm gonna write in text. I'm gonna write this is going to ureter. Okay. This is called the collecting duct. It's not really part of the nephron, but it's right there. So what's happening? Blood comes into Bowman's capsule, and it's in that glomerulus, which are capillaries. Those capillaries have very thin walls. The blood gets out of the capillaries, and it starts building up in this capsule, Bowman's capsule. It then travels through the proximal convoluted tubule, down the descending limb of the nephron loop, up the ascending limb of the nephron loop, through the distal convoluted tubule to the collecting duct, and it goes to the ureter. So whatever is getting filtered out of our blood here, and it gets to here, it goes through this big long tubule, and it gets to the other end. That's what goes to the ureter. That's what becomes our urine. Whatever's getting filtered out of our blood becomes our urine. PCT stands for proximal convoluted tubule. DCT stands for distal convoluted tubule. So I've drawn both of these as relatively straight, but they are kind of twisty and turny. They're convoluted. Proximal always means closer. Proximal convoluted tubule is closer to Bowman's capsule. The distal convoluted tubule, distal always means further away. The distal convoluted tubule is further from Bowman's capsule. So whatever gets squeezed out of the blood capillaries here and travels all the way through the PCT, down the nephron loop, up the other side of the nephron loop, through the DCT, gets into the collecting duct, goes to the ureter, right? So it's a big convoluted pathway that goes to the ureter. That's what becomes our urine. Now, the problem with that is what's causing things to leave the capillaries is just blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is high enough, it squeezes, right? The blood pressure is high enough here, it's squeezing, it's pushing out things from the blood vessels, from those capillaries. It can push things out through those little tiny pores. Well, a lot of times you push out too much. In fact, every time you push out too much, right? You push out all of the water, too much of the glucose and the sodium and the potassium and things that you need in your blood, right? So at this first stage, you actually are pushing a lot of things out. So now bear with me for a second. What happens is you have wrapped around here. Blood vessels, right? Capillaries. Now, wrapped around the nephron, each nephron are these capillaries. The nephron itself has a really thin layer of cells. The capillaries have a really thin layer of cells. What that allows for is for things to filter from the nephron into the capillary. So that as this fluid that I've drawn in green is moving through this nephron, the blood is able to reabsorb some of the glucose, some of the water, some of the sodium, some of the potassium, right? It's able to reabsorb some of those nutrients because too much got filtered out here, right? So I'm gonna draw, I'm gonna put a 1 here. 1 right there. And I'm gonna put a 2 right here. So in step 1, too much gets filtered out. In step 2, what you're doing is you're reabsorbing into the bloodstream. You're reabsorbing the nutrients that you need, right? Because you don't want to lose all of those nutrients. You want to reabsorb some of those. whatever does not get reabsorbed, the excess. In other words, you may have too much sodium in your blood. All of the sodium gets squeezed out here as that fluid is moving through here, reabsorbing sodium. Whatever's not reabsorbed by the time the fluid gets to this point in your nephron, right? There's no more capillaries around it. Whatever is still in the nephron remains in the nephron, and it goes to the ureter and it goes to the bladder. So excess, right? Excess sodium, excess potassium, excess glucose gets transferred to the bladder because you're only reabsorbing the amount that you need. This capillary that's wrapped around the nephron is called the peritubular capillary. Yeah. Okay. Peritubular. Peri means surrounding, tubule, so it's surrounding the tubule, and it's a capillary. So the role of the peritubular capillary is that as fluid is moving through this nephron, the peritubular capillary is reabsorbing a lot of those nutrients that got filtered out. Now that capillary, by the time you get to this end of the nephron, right, the distal convoluted tubule, that capillary I have coming back over here, right? That capillary, then I drew it as blue. That becomes your arcuate, your cortical radiate vein. So your cortical radiate artery brought blood into here. The cortical radiate vein, remember, is going to bring blood back out of the kidney, back to your heart. So whatever is here in this vein has already been filtered, right? This is the quote unquote clean blood. Whatever this green fluid, whatever reaches the ureter, travels through, this is going to travel through the collecting duct, through the renal papilla, through the minor calyx, through the major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, right? That's what this fluid is. Right. So I think some of that helped. Now, one more thing that I want to put on here is number 3. Okay, you're going to see 3 words in terms of urine formation, or 3 terms. The first step, or the first term in urine formation, is called glomerular filtration. That's what happens right here. We have the number 1. That's where things get filtered out of the glomerulus. Glomerular filtration, too much gets filtered out. Too much gets squeezed out of the blood. So your body compensates with step 2. Step 2 is called tubular reabsorption. As you're moving through the tubule, your body is reabsorbing those nutrients. Okay. So glomerulus, too much gets filtered out. Step 1, too much gets filtered out. Step 2, you're reabsorbing a lot of those nutrients. Step 3, once you get to kind of this end of where the capillary is surrounding glomerulus, step 3 is called tubular secretion. That allows, it's kind of the last chance to get anything that's still in your blood into the tubule. So a lot of times things like medications get passed at this point, they get filtered out of your bloodstream, passed into that tubule so they can make their way to the urine to get out of your body. Okay, so step 1, glomerular filtration. Step 2 is tubular reabsorption. Step 3 is tubular secretion. So again, I know this is a very rudimentary drawing. I'm not so good at drawing with the trackpad, but I want to make sure that you understand what's going on in the kidney, right? So again, we memorized that whole, or I want you to memorize that whole mess of arteries coming from the renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery. Then you have that cortical radiate artery, which branches into an afferent arteriole and a glomerulus, right? And then the peritubular capillary, which eventually becomes a cortical radiate vein, and you go back through the veins to get out of the kidney. So I'm gonna switch back to the PowerPoint for just a few more minutes. All right, so this is showing the blood flow, right? So we came in through renal arteries, segmental, interlobar, arcuate, cortical radiate. It branches into the nephron, right? The afferent arteriole brings the blood into the glomerulus, right? You have the peritubular capillaries surrounding the nephron. Then those lead to just what they call a venule, but that goes back to the cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, renal vein. So that's the blood flow. At this point, this is where the blood is being filtered in the nephron. And so what's coming out of the nephron is clean blood. It's been filtered. What's happening here from the nephron, whatever's in the nephron, not the blood, whatever's in the tubule of the nephron, gets sent through the renal papilla, through the minor calyx, through the major calyx, through the renal pelvis, to your ureter, to the bladder. Okay, so that's the major crux of this chapter. Okay, so here again they show you the nephron, right? They did a better job, obviously, than I can draw on the computer, but you can see the blood vessels, the afferent arteriole and the glomerulus going in, right? You can see that they call this capsule, they just call it the renal corpuscle. Some books call it Bowman's capsule. Some call it the renal corpuscle. But the glomerulus refers specifically to the capillaries within that. And this would be the proximal convoluted tubule, right? Then this is the nephron loop. You've got a descending limb and an ascending limb. Then this is the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. So the glomerular capsule is the same thing as the renal, as the Bowman's capsule. They just call it the glomerular capsule here. The renal corpuscle is the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus within it, right? The glomerulus is the blood vessels. Those are the blood vessels, I should say. Whereas the capsule is just the outer part, the actual part of the nephron. And the combination of two of them is called the renal corpuscle. Okay, so here's a bit of a closer picture. So that's what I want you to take from this. Okay, now there are different types of neurons or different types of nephrons, and that's the last thing that I want to go over with you. And this is a good picture of them. So in this picture, this pink line right here separates the cortex and the medulla. So down here below that pink line is medulla, up here is cortex. Some of these nephrons reside almost entirely in the cortex, and they're called cortical nephrons. So you can see here's Bowman's capsule, right? You can see the blood vessels going in. You can see the nephron, proximal convoluted tubule, the loop, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule. It meets up to a collecting duct. This is a collecting duct. And you can see there would be other nephrons meeting up with that same collecting duct, which brings the waste products through the renal papilla into the minor calyx, into the major calyx, into the renal pelvis, into the ureter. There are some nephrons whose loops go way down into the medulla, like this one. Those are called juxtamedullary nephrons. Now, most of our nephrons are cortical. Like 85% of them, they estimate are cortical. but about 15% of them are these juxtamedullary ones. And these juxtamedullary ones have a lot more to do with the osmotic gradient that's created within your kidneys, which we'll talk about more the next time we meet, which will be Friday. And so these ones have a really long loop, nephron loop, and it goes down really far into the renal medulla. And that allows for us to set up this countercurrent mechanism, which we'll talk about in the next time we meet. So what I want you to know from today, I want you to think about the blood flow into the kidney and through all those little blood vessels. I want you to know the regions of the nephron. I want you to know where that filtration happens. And I am going to go ahead and post this as tonight. The other thing that I realized over the weekend was that I had mistakenly not moved the assignments on Blackboard, or not on Blackboard, on Pearson accordingly, so that I've changed those so the dates are you have a couple more days to complete those assignments since we hadn't gone over anything yet. So that's where we are, right? So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. Send me any questions that you have, and we'll get right to it. We'll try to work on an answer to it. In the meantime, just have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.